This isn't just a podcast, it's a movement. The Middle Ground Mike is fighting for truth and unity. Subscribe now or support us today. Links are in the notes. Stand with us. What's up, Michigan? And what's up to everyone watching from everywhere else? This is Finding the Middle Local Edition, where we do the thing the internet hates. We slow down, tell the truth, and even when it makes both sides mad. Because this week in Michigan, it's been kind of crazy. And it's a perfect example of why people don't trust some of our institutions. They're playing games with money. Courts making decisions that hit hardworking people first. Detroit's stepping into a new era, and the winner reminding us nature doesn't care about your politics. If you value this kind of coverage, no left, no right forward, support the show at buymeacoffee.com/TMGM. Donate whatever you can. It helps keep us independent. And if you want the weekly local edition rundown in writing, get our newsletter. Link is going to be in the description or on the website. All right, 6 segments here, guys. 5 points each. Let's go. We're really going to dig into this. So Lansing's, the $645 million fight and why it feels like a setup. Very disappointing because I always talk about how purple our state is. But before we talk any of this stuff, before we can talk weather, crime, future of our Detroit, the future of Michigan, we have to talk about Lansing. Because this week, the message from the government sounded like we can pull the rug at any time. That just doesn't hit politicians. It hits services, profits, and communities. The $645 million move wasn't normal politics. It was a flex. House Republicans moved to cancel or stop roughly $645 million in certain state work project spending, and the way it happened is why people freaked out. According to Bridge, Michigan, the reporting described it as a rare, obscure lever that most people never see used at scale. Where some of this big problem comes in is the way they did it. Certain programs that people need get cut as essentially, collateral damage. Rather than doing things the right way, we've got people who need certain things that are going to face some collateral damage, and that's just not okay. Certain politicians have argued it's about the waste and forcing negotiations. The other side called it cruel and corrupt. Either way, taking things away for normal people is brutal. Your funding can become a bargaining chip overnight. If you're pro accountability, you still have to be pro process. Everything has to be a process. There's a process for everything, and there's a reason why. Here's the middle ground reality of this. Governments absolutely waste money, but voters also deserve transparency. But if the process feels like a surprise attack, it's because it doesn't build trust, it builds panic. And even with the goal, you should question the method of it. Because it creates instability for programs that touch real lives. Michigan's reaction this week showed something important that people don't just want. They don't just want cuts. They want things that are, okay, if those cuts, where's that money going to go? They want predictability, and they want to feel like you're being honest with them. Flint and RX kids got pulled into the blast radius. One of the specific reasons for this got so heated is because reporting highlighted specific impacts, including Flint-related funding and the status of programs like RX Kids being thrown. RX Kids, Flint, they're all part of the blast radius. That's where the rage bait becomes reality. Because Flint is already the symbol of what happens when government can fail and argues about it for a decade. If you're a resident, your recovery money might get yanked. It doesn't feel like politics. It feels like disrespect and a slap in your face. And if you're someone who thinks the state needs an audit, that's a great thing. Everything like that should be audited. You still don't want collateral damage of people who really need it to be the strategy. The next week is going to be essentially like lawsuit talk for everybody, right? And it can lead to some trust collapse. Democrats have indicated potential legal action over this, and nonprofits where the cuts could hit vulnerable families and services that, especially this time of year, people need. The Free Press reported it could take time to parse what got hit and how. But what's the translation to that? Next week becomes a fight, not just over money, but over the rules of power. What can do what, and when, and how fast. And that's when people tune out. That's when it starts feeling like the system is designed for other people, but not the average person. For the upper class and not the lower class. And it leaves the middle class stuck in limbo. And when trust breaks, it doesn't come back with one press conference. The middle ground take here is audit it, publish it, and stop governing like it's a hostage negotiation. Here's my standard. Let's show our work. If there's waste, publish a clean list, name it, and defend it with receipts. Because I think even people on the left and the right, if there's something that's a clear tragedy to the state taxpayer, to whatever taxpayer you want to call it, they are going to buy in. They're going to go, yeah, let's get rid of that because we can use it towards things that our kids or roads, infrastructure, whatever you want to call it, needs. But if there are essential services, protect them with clear carve-outs and transparency so citizens don't feel like they're ambushed. Michigan doesn't need more partisan wins. It needs a government that acts like adults handling a massive checkbook. Because when money becomes a weapon, every community becomes a target. These consequences, there's consequences to other things. The courts have gotten involved in undocumented, immigration workmen's comp situations. It brought up this week legal headlines that land right on the pressure points, right? Work, immigration, benefits, and fairness. And if you're a working class Michigander, you're already tired of watching debates that sometimes don't include you until you're the one paying. The Supreme Court declined to take up an immigrant and workers' comp case. The Michigan Supreme Court issued an order declining to hear a case involving whether undocumented workers can access workers' compensation benefits in Michigan. According to the Free Press and what I've seen on their site, the Free Press website, also the court's website, it was described as a closely divided outcome, which tells you how contested this is even among justices, who some of them are very conservative. So even they're not completely sold on which way is the right way to go. But for some people, it's about the rule of law. For others, it's about workplace reality. If people are working, get injured, what happens next? Either way, the court's move means the legal landscape stays tough and contested. This debate creates a perverse incentive nobody wants to say out loud. If you believe undocumented workers shouldn't receive benefits, and I'm talking like workman's comp benefits on the job, right? I'm not talking about welfare, things like that. Does it empower employers to take bigger risks because the worker has fewer protections? But, my thing is, we shouldn't even really be having to have this conversation. Employers who are hiring people illegally, that generally means they're not paying them the same level of benefits. That means they're undercutting you. And that's where we should start. We shouldn't even really have to have this conversation, in my opinion, because not necessarily go after the workers, the illegal workers, but go after the companies that keep hiring them like that. Let's get these people on the payrolls. Let's do the right thing. The real villain is a system that allows shadow labor markets to exist and then pretend shock when tragedy follows. Next week's political messaging will be designed to make you hate your neighbor. What happens now? You'll see clips framing Michigan as anti-immigrant or Michigan is rewarding illegality. That's how content goes viral, right? But it's not always the truth. And sometimes it's a lot more complicated than that, which I think it is in this situation. It turns complicated systems into tribal screaming matches. But when voters care about is simpler, is they care about safe workplaces, and they care about is the playing field fair, which is why if a company's employing somebody illegally, we need to hold them accountable. The middle ground solution path, enforce labor laws. Punish, if you're doing something like that, we need to punish that person. Or I should say worker, right? Not worker, but company. You want fewer illegal labor incentives? Go after the employers and contractors who build business models on it. You want fewer workplace injuries? Increase enforcement. Make safety violations financially devastating if it's caused by, ignorance or lack of caring. You want fairness for citizens and legal residents? Don't let companies undercut wages through informal labor channels. Michigan could lead here. We generally lead on things like this, but it requires both Democrats and Republicans coming together and admitting that status quo benefits not the working class. And there's a lot of companies out there that do the right thing and they get undercut. But the biggest loser in this fight is the little contractor, the average guy, the regular worker every time. The people with billions, they're not going to notice. When the system stays messy, the worker loses. When the worker loses, families lose. And when families lose, communities get angrier, more divided, and easier to manipulate. That's why these debates being framed as moral superiority contests instead of practical fixes is exactly why people feel politically homeless. I really want to throw out there, immigrants, especially here in the state of Michigan, are a huge part of our community. They've done a lot of great things here. And especially, nobody wants to get hurt at work and not have any kind of safety net. So, we really have to, Why this is even a thing, I don't know. If we enforced existing laws, like, you don't need to make new laws to solve this problem. We already have these laws on the books. It's just, it's enforced based, sometimes it feels like it's enforced based on political situations. And that's just not right. But let's kind of transition a little bit here into Detroit's new era. The city's heading into a major transition, and it matters statewide, right? Like former Governor Rick Snyder said, a strong Detroit means a strong Michigan. Because what happens in Detroit is going to set the tone for business confidence in the state, public safety perception, and the national narrative about Michigan. Detroit's mayoral transition is already underway with the first 100 days planning. Report describes the mayor-elect's transition as aiming for tangible early goals, things that they can actually accomplish, not just rhetoric. They are seeking broad community input with engagement and a roadmap approach. That sounds good, but Detroiters have heard plans before. The real test is not slogans, it's whether neighborhoods outside the nice parts feel change in safety, services, and opportunity. And next week, you'll see people trying to brand every decision as either historic or catastrophic because fear sells. The Duggan legacy conversation is heating up as the clock runs out. As Mayor Mike Duggan nears the end of his tenure, coverage reflected on the bankruptcy-era recovery infrastructure work and criticism that benefits weren't evenly distributed across the neighborhoods. That's the Detroit argument in one sentence. Progress happened versus progress didn't reach me. If your block still looks abandoned, you don't care how many ribbon cuttings happen downtown. Next week will feature legacy defense and legacy attacks. And the Detroit story is also Michigan's economic story. Detroit is not just a city, it's a signal. It's the brand outsiders use to judge Michigan. Fairly or unfairly, it is what it is. If the transition feels stable, investment follows. If it feels chaotic, businesses aren't going to get what seems to make sense, the investment's going to pause and things will get worse. Just look at the history that led up to the bankruptcy. That's why every Detroit handoff becomes a statewide ripple effect. From small business confidence to political narratives heading towards 2020. But what should we watch this coming week? Check out your public safety messaging, neighborhood equity promises. Expect a wave of I will fix crime messaging and I will invest in neighborhoods messaging. But here's a center's demand. Show specifics. Tell me how you're going to get me from where I'm at to where I'm going. We all know where we want to go. How are you going to get me there? Which resource will move? What gets measured monthly? What happens when metrics don't improve? The era of trusting just vibes needs to be over. We want dashboards, timelines, and accountability. Michigan's lesson? If Detroit can't unite its story, the whole state could stay divided. Detroit is a mirror. If we can't talk honestly about what improved and what didn't, we stay trapped in propaganda. The goal isn't to declare Detroit perfect or doomed. It's to tell the truth and pressure leadership to deliver. That's how you build a state where people want to stay in. If you like this local edition format, support the show at buymeacoffee.com/TMGM. Donate what you can. One coffee helps keep this independent and keeps research coming. And if you want weekly Michigan Breakdown, join the newsletter. All right, let's get back to it. Let's kind of transition a little bit here into some public safety headlines, right? You had the Brown University incident, which arrested some of those people. And, you had the incident in Australia. We had the incident this week in Muskegon. It was heartbreaking.
Let's take a quick break.
The Middle Ground, Mike, isn't just another podcast. It's a movement for unity, for truth, for a future beyond the left and the right. But movements don't grow without people willing to stand up. Subscribe now on Buzzsprout. Fuel this mission directly on PayPal. Every subscription keeps the fire burning. The links are in the show notes. Be more than a listener. Be part of the Middle Ground. And the hardest part is how fast we've seemed to normalize this sometimes, where it turns into arguments about this or that, rather than a lot of these people seem to have issues long before these things happen. We want thoughts and prayers. We want people to care. We want people to think about it. But we also have to take steps beyond that. They want a system that actually stops producing the same outcomes. This shooting in Muskegon, it's community trauma now, familiar pattern. Reporting described the Muskegon shooting that left multiple victims, including deaths and a child injured. Every time this happens, the online script starts immediately. Blame guns, blame culture, blame poverty, blame policing. And the people closest to it are thinking, none of your talking points bring back anyone. Michigan needs fewer viral arguments and more serious local prevention strategies because this cycle is exhausting. The anger is growing because people feel unprotected and unheard. When violence spikes or feels random, it breaks something deeper than safety. It breaks trust. People change routes. They avoid areas. Kids, they pull their kids inside earlier, and they lose that outside thing that we seem to want to get our kids back to because they don't feel safe letting them go outside. And then we act surprised when communities fray and businesses leave. Nobody wants to be around that. Whether it's a suburb or an inner city, nobody wants to be around that. Public safety isn't a right wing or left wing. It's the foundation of everything we establish as a community. The politics around crime has a really bad chance of getting uglier this week. Because as we head towards the 2026 election cycle, you'll see content designed to make you terrified or furious. One side will post every crime like it proves leadership failure, or the other side will post statistics that tell you not to believe your own eyes. But the middle ground is you can acknowledge progress and acknowledge people still feel unsafe in many places and come up with a plan and a process to impact both. Perception matters because perception changes behavior. What Michigan can actually do, do targeted enforcement, real prevention, faster prosecution clarity, not blanket slogans, targeted strategies. Focus on repeat violent offenders, illegal guns, and small number of people driving the large share of harm, while also funding credible intervention programs that actually show results. There's a lot of people that get involved in these situations that have mental issues. And prosecutors and courts, they're doing a better job, but they still have to communicate outcomes clearly because silence creates rumor and rumor creates rage. The public doesn't need propaganda. It needs proof of competence. The rage bait truth? Leaders argue on TV while families pay the price. This is the part people don't want to admit. The loudest voices usually don't live with the consequences. The families do. The neighborhoods do. The small businesses do. And this is why this show exists. To keep pressure on all these situations without turning citizens into enemies. Because remember, we all live next door to each other. We all eat the same food. We breathe the same air. My gosh, Michigan's winter is always undefeated. We got the wind chill is going to get extreme. There's ice tragedies throughout the state, a lot of snow. Comment below. I know the UP got a crazy amount of snow this week. Not this week, but actually so far, really. Down here, a little bit south of Detroit, this is probably the most snow we've had stay to me in a hot minute. But we got to normalize being ready for this stuff. Make sure you talk about the warming shelters and things like that. If you see a homeless person that truly needs the help, point it out to them. Do what you can to help them. Let's pressure Lansing to, create more places for these people to go permanently. And I'm not talking about a jail. I'm talking about halfway housing. Let's transition into, health, money, marijuana tax, school vaccine data, and who's paying for what. Sorry, had to take a drink. Got some water here. This week, this is where this can get a little spicy and debates get spicy because it's money, health, kids, and government. And the coming week is going to bring more arguments than generate heat. A new 24% wholesale marijuana tax is headed for January. A Michigan judge already declined to block it. And the legal challenges are probably going to continue. That fight includes claims about whether the tax improperly changes the voter-approved legislation framework and whether it needed a higher vote threshold. And here's what regular people hear. Prices might change, businesses might get squeezed, and the roads somehow are a part of this deal. Expect this to become a major talking point this week and pay close attention. This becomes a culture war argument, but it's a governance argument. One side will say tax on the roads, regulate it. Another side will say you're breaking the will of the voters and punishing small operators. But the middle ground question is the policy transparent, constitutional, and is it economically realistic? Or is it another patchwork fix that creates new problems down the road? Michigan doesn't need more symbolic wins. We need to keep pushing towards systems that don't collapse every time someone files a lawsuit. Schools and vaccination rates, right? These new bills push more transparency. Michigan lawmakers this week introduced bills pushing for schools to disclose vaccination rates to parents, which is fair. Tied to broader debates about immunization policy. This topic can get heated fast because it touches on kids, trust, medicine, and misinformation all at once. The center's position is pretty clear. Parents deserve clear information, public health deserves clear data, and debate should stay grounded in reality instead of weaponized fear. Expect this point to spread online next week because it's algorithm gold. Farmer mental health is getting overdue attention, and it's a nonpartisan issue. Bridge, Michigan reported efforts on pushing to prevent farmer suicide funding and alarming risk levels in farming-related occupations. This is Michigan in a nutshell. Both proud, hardworking, quietly hurting. This week, let's watch whether Lansing treats this stuff like a real emergency or just a headline. The local truth: Michigan's biggest battles are trust battles. Whether it's taxes, vaccines, schools, or mental health, the core issue is trust. People don't trust government motives. They trust corporate motives. They don't trust the media. And they don't trust each other half the time anymore because politics have trained them not to. The fix isn't one policy, it's rebuilding credibility, rebuilding confidence through transparency, measurable results, and leaders who stop treating citizens like pawns. Let's do a little bit of a bonus one. This week, our elections and the conversation lit up once again online. And not because of a law change, a scandal raid, or some dramatic court ruling. It's about voter rolls, investigations, and accusations flying forward towards the Attorney General's office. Fair or not, I don't know, you decide. If you live in Michigan, though, this matters because confidence in our elections hinges on legitimacy and trust. Non-voting citizen claims again have resurfaced, and Nessel's office is involved. There were reports that Michigan officials identified about 15 suspected non-citizen voting cases from 2024 election, and the state is reviewing them. It's a tiny fraction, but online it gets used like the proof of a massive conspiracy. But that's how fear travels. It takes something rare and makes it feel common. Because people who already don't trust the system can treat this like confirmation because they see it and they don't feel like it gets paid attention to. Critics are saying the rolls are bloated. Defenders say cleanup is normal. Voter rolls can include outdated registrations because people move, die, don't update records. That's the reality nationwide. The political war that bloat proves fraud or proves bureaucracy. Nessel's office has prosecuted election violations to be completely fair. And that's why people are mad. Some people want aggressive prosecution because they think it restores trust. Some people think the prosecutions are selective and political. And that actually can worsen distrust if people feel that way. But here's what we think is true. Inconsistent messaging creates a vacuum. And the vacuum gets filled by the loudest fears and liars. If you want confidence, you can't prosecute quietly and communicate poorly. The bigger narrative now just isn't about fraud, it's about trust. What's driving intensity isn't just incidents, it's the fear that the system is either rigged or unprotected. One side argues even a few mistakes can erode trust. The other argues exaggeration destroys trust. Both parties can be right, and both get used by operatives or special interests that some of them want to make you hate your neighbor. Because next week you'll see a storm of content that's going to be built for rage, not solutions. But here's our position, my position. Audit, improve, explain, but don't weaponize fear. We're already in tough economic conditions. We need confidence. We need hope. We need a better tomorrow. And what we shouldn't do is take isolated instances and suggest apocalypse or ignore issues because it's politically inconvenient. Elections should be secure. They should be transparent and trusted. And that means facts over fear and audit over accusation. Nuance doesn't go viral, but it does keep a state functional. And this is Finding the Middle Local Edition. I appreciate everybody tuning in, I should say. If you really want to support this show, please go to buymeacoffee.com/TMGM. Donate what you can, or, hey, you like this hoodie? They're on the website too. The hat, I got a nifty little polo here as well. They're all on the middlegroundmike.com. Sign up for our newsletter, check out our blogs. Stay tuned next week. We got some really great content coming this week. Tomorrow, part 2 of the Sickness Synergy episode comes out. We've got a surprise episode coming out Tuesday. We got some great guest interviews coming this week. Stay tuned. No left, no right forward. This is the Middle Ground Mike. My name's Joe. Have a good Sunday.